you're saying coming here was a bad idea. I'm beginning to agree with you.
According to researchers, The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi were unanimously considered by Star Wars fans to be two of the greatest releases in the franchise's storied history. In fairness, this research was conducted by me, and I only asked one guy who admitted he's never seen them, but he did say the trailers looked cool, so I guess the jury is still kind of out? Of course, those two titles are the two Disney Star Wars movies that have been released to date, with the third and final installment, The Rise of Skywalker, on its way. What's the difference between a Disney Star Wars movie and a regular Star Wars movie, you might ask? Well, to put it plainly, the difference is George Lucas. You see, old Georgie boy created this whole Star Wars thing on his own and launched it in 1977 with the release of Episode 4: A New Hope, although at the time it was just called Star Wars. The film quickly became a cult phenomenon and was followed up 3 years later by the equally as legendary Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. By the time Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, came out 3 years after that, Star Wars was already widely considered an international sensation and would go down as one of the greatest movie franchises of all time. Only, it didn't stop there. Those 3 sequential films were only 1/3 of Lucas's 9-film game plan. He waited all the way until 1999 to release the 4th movie in the series, but the very first in the sequence with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. That was followed in 2002 by Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and in 2005 by Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
Hello there.
Those 3 trilogy movies were, how do I put this, a little less well received compared to the original 3.
It's stylistically designed to be that way, and you can't undo that.
Whether the expectations were too high, or they waited too long in between trilogies, or they just weren't that good, the prequels definitely failed to live up to the Star Wars moniker. Luckily for Lucas, he had 3 more films in mind to close out the series and totally redeem himself. Then in 2012, he sold everything to Disney for over $4 billion. As part of the sale, he also gave up his creative control over the direction of Star Wars and became nothing more than a glorified consultant. As mentioned before, Disney has already produced The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and the grand finale, The Rise of Skywalker, is on the way. They also have a bunch of other side movies and a whole slew of new shows coming out on Disney+. What's interesting is how little say George Lucas has in any of those projects. In fact, it was recently leaked that he offered Disney notes on how Star Wars should end and what the final films should be about, only to have them ignore pretty much all of his suggestions.
Boring conversation anyway.
He was reportedly pretty frustrated and cheesed off by this. I mean, I'd be pretty ticked off too if I started the most popular movie franchise of all time and then didn't get an opportunity to wrap it up and finish telling the story the way I wanted to. Then again, I'd probably just think about my $4 billion and feel a lot better.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
Needless to say, if George Lucas had stayed at the helm of the ship, the latest Star Wars movie would have been very different. Also, what's with needless to say? Is that a dumb saying or what? I still totally said the thing immediately after it. If I didn't, then you'd have no clue what I was talking about. I absolutely needed to say.
Which reminds me.
Lucas offered some input, but it ultimately wasn't used, and he felt pretty betrayed and even made some pretty harsh remarks about Disney. Their final 3 installments have been met with mixed reviews, but there's no telling how much better or worse Lucas's version would have been. From the reports, he had mapped out the final 3 films in detail, and it sounds pretty crazy. In a recent memoir by Disney CEO Bob Iger, he talked about the Lucasfilm acquisition and George's involvement in the new trilogy. He mentions that he read George's outlines and decided to buy them, although they made it very clear in the purchase agreement that he would not be contractually obligated to use any of the plot lines. He knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept, Iger explained. He continued saying, and so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas, but like the outlines, we would be under no obligation. Well, when it came time to explain the plot that Disney had landed on, George quickly realized that they didn't take his advice and got pretty upset. Of course, he felt a certain level of betrayal, as well as disappointment that he wouldn't be able to conclude his own project the way he saw fit.
Who's the girl?
Then again, they did make it clear that they weren't obligated to do so, and that $4 billion kind of makes it tough to feel bad for the guy. You know, you can't really claim to get ripped off when you walk away with $2.2 billion in cash and another $1.86 billion in Disney stock. George Lucas can sob all he wants. At least he can wipe those tears with $100 bills.
Perhaps you think you're being treated unfairly?
No.
Also, keep in mind the prequel trilogy wasn't a unanimous win. Lucas had total control over those films, which many fans thought were terrible.
I don't like sand.
It's easy to say now that Lucas would have done a better job with his latest trilogy, but his track record is kind of a 50-50 crapshoot. It seriously could have gone either way. It's also important to remember that Lucas was under no obligation to sell the franchise prior to finishing his 9-movie plan. He could have finished it off and then sold everything, but he didn't. He made the decision to sell, and he got compensated more than fairly.
I see your point, sir.
Okay, enough about contracts and production decisions. What the heck did GL have planned that Disney didn't use? In a tie-in book for James Cameron's story of science fiction, a conversation between the two legendary directors dropped some hints about what Lucas had planned for the final Star Wars trilogy. I'll give you the direct quote from George himself. The next 3 Star Wars films were going to get into a microbiotic world, but there's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them wills. And the wills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force. He continues, back in the day, I used to say ultimately what this means is we were just cars, vehicles for the wills to travel around. We're vessels for them. And the conduit is the Midi-Chlorians. The Midi-Chlorians are the ones that communicate with the wills. The wills, in a general sense, well, they are the Force.
This is getting out of hand.
Okay, so there's quite a bit to unpack there. Clearly, he had an idea of how he wanted the final 3 films to go, and Disney instead did absolutely none of it. Clearly, he had this mapped out for a while, considering the whole thing was foreshadowed as of episode 1.
I need a Midi-Chlorian count.
I guess the first moral of this story is don't sell your company if you aren't cool with not being in control of it anymore.
Well, that's the real trick, isn't it?
More importantly, the wills seem like a fascinating concept. It probably would have irked a ton of fans who weren't so thrilled about the Midi-Chlorians in the first place. Lucas even admitted it later in the conversation. Everybody hated it in Phantom Menace when we started talking about Midi-Chlorians. So, what do when audiences hate an idea of yours? You double down and you give it to them again. Only this time, even more complicated than last time. It's safe to assume that fans would have probably hated this wills concept. After all, they're still not completely over the Midi-Chlorians, and that was over 20 years ago. However, underneath the weirdness of the whole idea, I actually kinda like where Lucas was going with this. It totally ties into the entire theme of the series, which in a word is destiny. Or in a couple more words, Star Wars is essentially about fighting against the concept of destiny or fate and instead forging your own path. The wills, to a degree, would have been antagonists. They secretly control everything and decide the fate of the universe using the Force. That's Georgie's way of offering up a scientific answer to something so inherently intangible and vague like destiny.
Strong am I with the Force, but not that strong.
If you think about it, The Last Jedi kinda hit the same note. Instead of giving fate a face as Lucas could have done with the wills, the movie combats the idea of it through the institutions that upheld it, like the Jedi Order.
It's time for the Jedi to end.
For example, the fact that the supposed sacred Jedi texts were not all they were meant to be, or the fact that Yoda tells our heroes that new generations need to find their own path, beyond the rules established by the past.
Time it is for you to look past a pile of old books.
All of these things are present in The Last Jedi and refuse the prophecies that defined Star Wars for so long. It was all about going against the grain and defying the status quo rather than be controlled. While we still don't know exactly how it'll play out in the end, The Rise of Skywalker offers the perfect opportunity to see new heroes and villains like Rey and Kylo Ren forge their own fates within the Force rather than sticking to the guidelines that defined Luke, Yoda, Obi-Wan, and all the other Force wielders before them. New beginnings, fight the power, all that good stuff.
What does that mean?
I'm not sure.
According to a recent interview with director J.J. Abrams, George Lucas was heavily involved in the upcoming The Rise of Skywalker. They met up with him before writing the script to consult on how they could properly wrap up 3 trilogies and the greater overall story arc with this one film. I highly doubt they'll be using the wills, but Lucas being involved can only be a good thing, right? Right? What do you think? Will Rise of Skywalker live up to the hype, or are you trying not to get your hopes up? And would you have preferred the latest releases the way they were, or George Lucas's microbiotic version better? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Before you go, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to Screen Rant to stay up to date on all of our latest releases. Until next time, may the Force be with you.
Do or do not. There is no try.